You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarti.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hi, my name's Amy McDonald. I program this joint, and it's killing me. How many people it's your first time here? A lot, most of you. Come back. I like to call this City Space, WBUR City Space, in 92nd Street Y of New York, a little mini 92nd Street Y of New York. Come to the website, wburcityspace.events. We have such an eclectic array of lineups. Not only are we doing author readings like tonight, we are doing debates, we're having policy issues, we're doing cooking, we're doing live podcasts, moth stories, slams, music, dance, we do everything. There's something for everyone. So I encourage you to come and come back. It's a gorgeous space. It's a new civic institution for Boston. The microphones outside record, broadcast what's going on inside. So often we have people stop and listening and sitting on the benches and peering to see what's inside and what's going on. So welcome and come back. I'd like to introduce Téa Obreht, our author for tonight, and our moderator, Leila Meglio, am I pronouncing your name correctly, from Porter Square Books, who will be interviewing her. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And Téa, thank you for joining us. You're all here, so presumably you know, but this is Téa Obreht. She is the author of The Tiger's Wife, which was a National Book Award finalist and winner of the Orange Prize. And her new book is the wonderful and fascinating sort of Western magical realism world, Inland. So we thought that we would start you off with a little reading.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Porter Square Books for having me, and to WBUR City Space for hosting this event. It's an amazing venue. I've very rarely done events where I can actually look outside into the street as I read. Thank you for my family who are here. All the way from Maine. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book. So this is a book that came about. I had been researching the American West because I was spending a lot of time there. In the course of my research, I came across a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class, which I don't know if any of you are fans of that, but if you're history buffs, it's fantastic. And it detailed, the episode that I heard detailed an encounter between two homesteading women and a creature of potentially supernatural origins, which actually turns out to be rooted in a little-known military experiment in the American Southwest in the 1850s. So as soon as I heard it, I became completely obsessed with the true story and the campfire yarn that it produced. And I started asking myself questions about who were these women? What was the journey of this creature? How does this story actually hold together and come together? And what kind of myth is it trying to make? So the book has two narrators. One is Lurie, and the other is Nora. She's a homesteading woman. So I'm going to read from Lurie's section for a moment. He opens the book. Oops. This is the first chapter, and it's called The Missouri. When those men rode down to the fording place last night, I thought us done for. Even you must realize how close they came, their smell, the song of their bridles, the whites of their horses' eyes. True to form, blind though you are, and with that shot still irretrievable in your thigh, you made to stand and meet them. Perhaps I should have let you. It might have averted what happened tonight, and the girl would be unharmed. But how could I have known? I was unready, disbelieving of our fate, and in the end could only watch them cross and ride up the wash away from us in the moonlight. And wasn't I right to wait? For habit, if nothing else. I knew you had flight in you yet. You still do. As do I, as I have all my life, since long before we fell in together, when I first came round to myself, 6 years old, and already on the run, wave-rocked, with my father in the bunk beside me, and all around the hiss of water against the hull. It was my father running back then, though from what I never knew. He was thin, I think. Young, perhaps. A blacksmith, perhaps, or some other hard-laboring man who never caught more rest than he did that swaying month when night and day went undiffered, and there was nothing but the creak of rope and pulley somewhere above us in the dark. He called me Sine, and some other name I've struggled lifelong to recall. Of our crossing, I remember mostly foam veins and the smell of salt, and the dead, of course, outlaid in their white shrouds side by side along the stern. We found lodging near the harbor. Our room overlooked laundry lines that cross-hatched from window to window until they vanished in the steam of the wash-house below. We shared a mattress and turned our backs to the madman across the room and pretended he wasn't a bit further gone each day than the last. There was always somebody shrieking in the halls, somebody caught between worlds. I lay on my side and held the lapel of my father's coat and felt the lice roving through my hair. I never met a man so deep sleeping as my father. Dock work will do that, I reckon. Every day would find him straining under some crate or hump of rope that made him look an ant. Afterwards, he'd take my hand and let the river of disembarking bodies carry us away from the quays, up the thoroughfare to where the steel scaffolds were rising. They were a marvel to him, curious as he was about the world's workings. He had a long memory, a constant toothache, and an abiding hatred of Turks that tended to flare up when he took tea with like-minded men. But a funny thing would happen if ever some Serb or Magyar started in about the iron fist of Stambul. My father, so fixed in his enmity, would grow suddenly tearful. Well, Effendi, he'd say, are you better off now, better off here? Ali Pasha Rizvanbegovic was a tyrant, but far from the worst. At least our land was beautiful and our homes were our own. Then would follow wistful reminiscences of his boyhood village. A tumble of stone houses split by a river so green he had no word for it in his new tongue, and had to say it in the old one, thus trapping it forever as a secret between the two of us. What I'd give to remember that word. I could not think why he would leave such a town for this reeking harbor, which turned out to be the kind of place where praying palms up, and a name like Haji Osman Juric got him mistaken for a Turk so often he disowned both. I believe he called himself Hodgman Drury for a while, but he was buried Haj Lurie, thanks to our landlady's best guess at the crowded consonants of his name when the hearse came to take the body away. Our mattress, I remember, was stained. I stood on the stairs to watch the coachman load my father into his wagon. When they drove off, the landlady put her hand on my head and let me linger. The evening downpour had withdrawn, so a sunset reddened the street. The horses looked ablaze. After that, my father never came to me again, not in the waters and not even in dreams. So Lurie, he ends up on an orphan train headed for Missouri, and there he is taken into the household of a man called Sorel, and he joins. He sort of becomes the brother of these two young men, one of whom dies and haunts him for the rest of his life, and the other who starts a gang of outlaws, and Lurie finds himself on the run from a marshal. His storyline is taking place in 1856, but the other half of the book takes place in 1893 in Arizona Territory, which at the time was unincorporated, and follows a homesteading woman named Nora. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from her section too, from her first section, and we'll meet her, and then we'll talk. She lives in a city called Amargo. Toby came running back from the creek, empty-handed, to tell her he'd found more tracks, down by the creek this time. "All right," Nora said. "Show me." She reined up and followed her youngest into the gulch. The trail narrowed between high bluffs and led out among the black imbrications of an ancient riverbed before winding for a quarter-mile through cottonwoods down to the shore. Little remained of the stream now save glossy September mud and the wakes of what few salamanders had managed to evade Toby. He pointed to where his bucket had dropped. "Them's the tracks." "Those are," Nora said. It relieved her to see his hair growing back. Through 3 sons and 17 years of motherhood, shaving had borne out as the only successful campaign against lice, but its effects were decidedly punitive. Toby looked like a deserter from some urchin militia sentenced to bear the badge of his dishonor. What if this time history should fail him, leaving him bald forever? He made a sorry little man as it was, too thin for 7, soft and golden and clued up with doubt, prone to his father's wilding turn of mind. This business with the tracks had rooted deep, displacing all his other worries, and earning him the derision of his brothers, Rob and Dolan, who wouldn't brook a child's ghost story now that they were so adamantly men. The only solution they were charitable enough to entertain, "Just say the word and we'll bait it, Tobe," ran thoroughly against his inclinations, for Toby had no great wish to see the beast, merely to be believed in the matter of its existence. Last week, the boys had taken him out to the abandoned Flores claim, site of the track's initial manifestation, to cure him of his nonsense. By what means, Nora could not guess, though she had managed to refrain from warning them to mind his bad eye. They were her boys, Emmett's sons. Recent outbursts aside, they were upright and vigilant, careful with others in general and with Toby in particular. Still, she had waited on the porch until they reappeared in the red boil of twilight, 2 horses dragging long shadows, Dolan bobbing stoutly along, Rob a few yards ahead, and so starved-looking at 16 that she wondered how he was managing to keep Toby upright in the saddle before him with just one arm. "Well," she called, "did you bare your teeth to whatever's out there?" Rob lifted him down. "There wasn't nothing out there but some grouse and an empty old turtle shell, and we're all agreed that none of them's fixing to haunt Toby ever again." A tiny smile dragged the corner of Toby's mouth, and the matter seemed at an end. But then followed morning after morning of Toby at breakfast, his eyes red with sleeplessness, chin slipping from his hand, mishandled eggs staining the hen yard in his wake. Nights, while her husband Emmett hunched over his sentinel drafts in the kitchen and Rob and Dolan lay dead to the world upstairs, Nora put her ear to Toby's door and listened to the restless rasp of his body under the covers. Predictably, Emmett traced their son's distress to what they were now calling last year's mischance. Anything that went sideways with Toby could be explained away by it, a fall from horseback last March, indistinct by all appearances from any of the dozen Toby had brushed off over the years, so very ordinary in its course that Nora hadn't even bothered to go to him when he fell. I doubt it could have been helped. Doc Almenara had assured her, having declared it a miracle that Toby wasn't blinded outright. They had been waiting ever since on the sight in his left eye to return, and for reprieve from some of the accident's other miseries, headaches that sent him retching, lightning that streamed through his field of vision, an inability to distinguish waking from dreaming. He had come to fear the dark, and the shapes that roared out at him from the electric chasm of injured sleep. And to make matters worse, he mistook Nora's tenderness for pity, which she found unfair. She could not help wanting on those frequent occasions when he bumped a wall or missed a cup handle to seize his little head and hold it in both hands. Had he been too young to question her or old enough to understand, Toby might have grit his teeth through such attentions, but he was just the right age to find them unbearable. Luckily, however, it was past him to question why she might be crouching streamside with him now, making a big show of hearing him out. "Look," he said, "see?" She looked. Familiar disturbances marred the bank, a crisscross of skunk and quill pig trails, the smooth sidewind of a snake crossing the wash. There, Toby said, and there, see how it's sunk in at the top? He was pointing to a dent about the size of a small plate. The drag of his finger through the mud succeeded only in making it look like a picture book heart. Anything else? He showed her where he thought he could see a few more scuffs scraping off into the sage and up the old game trail with its trim of heat-withered grass. It must have gone up that way, Toby said, loosing these rocks as it went. Care to offer a thought on what it is? Well, it ain't small. To prove this, he beckoned her to the overgrown hackberry stand just up the shore. Its branches were stripped bare all the way around. The few remaining berries, a withered orrery of orange globes, were all packed way back against the thorn bowl. See? There's not a creature alive won't make quick work of hackberries in a drought, Tobe. She grew irritated. Save for Josie, it seems. Didn't I tell her to come and get the rest of these picked before the birds beat her to it? She shouldered in for a fruit and offered it to Toby, but he only squeezed it until its skin snapped and the grit ran between his fingers. Then he wiped his hand on his trouser leg. He was sulling. What's the matter? You think I'm telling tales, he said. You won't even look around. Aren't I looking? Not like you really think you can find anything. She seized her trouser legs and shoved into the thicket, pretending to look for sign. The boys still called this hillside the Antelope Trail, though any namesake antelope were long gone, having wised up quick enough to the shoddy little blind Emmett had built at the top of the gulch back when they were newcomers here. These days, the slope was a scald of dead grass, one switchback after another twisting all the way up the red face of the bluff. The only heartbeat around might belong to the occasional chaparral cock scurrying from shrub to shrub. Here was one now, of course. It took off the moment her shadow touched it. She stood in a drowse among the new ironwoods, still pretending. The sun had got into her. Damn near all morning she had gone without thinking of her thirst. Something miraculous had happened while she slept to make it seem as matter-of-fact as breathing. She was slow and warm and glad now that Toby had delayed her going into town. She could take less frenzied stock of matters. That Emmett was 3 days late returning from Cumberland with water was not so unusual. He could be no later than this evening, and there was a little water yet in the rain barrel to last until then. Nor was it unusual to find Rob and Dolan's beds empty. They had managed to pack up in the dark and make their way to the print house, as they often did, without waking her. As soon as she had put Toby's fears to rest, she would ride into town with their lunch the long way, calm and unhurried. She might even feel brave enough to stop by Desma's place and pick up the elk steaks after all. Call on Harlan, perhaps, and see if the sheriff's day was slow going. There's nothing up here, Tobe. You ain't gone but 10 yards. Toby. He wouldn't look at her. When do you figure I can turn back? When some snake bit? What'll you do then, all alone, and your brother's way out in town? She had drifted somehow into trying to coax a smile out of him. You gonna throw your mama over your shoulder and carry her all the way back up the draw by yourself? His voice was ruinously sad. That's all right, Mama. Please come back. She went on. Stowaway burrs dimpled her hem. Goodbye. She climbed the narrowing trail to its first hairpin where the undergrowth lay flattened over the path. A huge brown grasshopper sailed from stalk to stalk, becoming a distant rustle. Some 20 yards above her, snags of moss were outspread across the brush, as sunburnished and red as the dead girl she and Emmett had dragged out of a cave down in the hollow their first summer here. Kindling crisp. In the places where her muscle had dried out, the skin had stiffened and dented. A thatch of orange moss, just like this, capped her skull. No sign of how she'd got there, though Emmett had notioned she must have crawled in to get away from the heat and never crawled out. Grinning to herself for 100 years, or 1,000, they hadn't been able to tell. There's nothing, Tobe. Below, her son was frowning at the riverbank. Don't it look cloven to you, Mama? No. She watched him. Why should it? He shrugged a little, but his real concerns were finally loose now, and there was no pretending otherwise. Interest in cloven hooves, like every other recent absurdity, could only point back to Josie, Emmett's ward and occult cousin. Pig hooves are cloven, Nora said. Remember what those look like? I don't, hardly. Nora held up 2 fingers. They leave a trail like moth wings. She went back down to him, and they looked at the red mud together. It's not cloven, Tobe. No matter what Josie's been putting in your head. She's putting nothing. Well, she certainly isn't helping your elocution. All the way back along the creek bed, the empty bucket clanked against his thigh. His free hand was stuffed in his pocket, out of her reach. Thank you.
Téa, thank you so much for that introduction to...
I would just remind the audience to ask questions. I should have mentioned, if you go to slido.com on your phone and plug in TEA814, you can type in your questions and then let us see.
Yes, and it's pretty cool. So go ahead and do that. I think they'll even pop up on the screen and you can vote on them. So why not? Let's play with these fancy toys. So thank you for giving us that introduction to Nora and Lori, who are two very different characters who seem to kind of ride on parallel paths. So both of them, I would say, are sort of unexpected figures for the West. Nora is a homesteader and a wife, and, usually you're thinking of these Western stories as being, cowboys and Indians and shootouts, which there is some of that if you're looking for it. So, but she's got a distinct perspective. And then there's Lurie, who is, of sort of mysterious Middle Eastern origin. He's on this orphan train. He's a little bit of an outlaw. So, what brought you to sort of bring this story to life through these two people in particular?
So, thank you so much for that question. I think it became very clear early on, as a result of that, of having heard that podcast and hearing the history in this very, very particular way, that one story was going to belong to a homesteading woman in the 1890s, and the other was going to belong to someone who was going to join up with I'm just going to say it. Someone who was going to join up with the camel cavalry from that arrived in Texas in 1857. This is a little known fact, but it's true of American history. Camels were brought here in 1856 actually, for to serve as pack animals in the American Southwest. There was a dance going on, and I just wanted to acknowledge his efforts. So camels were brought in as pack animals in the Southwest, and they staked actually what is now the majority of Route 66. And we don't know that. And I was so interested in this history. There's not a lot of information about it. And as I started researching it, it became really, really clear that the character of Lurie would have to be someone who derived a very particular bond from undertaking this journey with the men who came over from the Ottoman Empire to lead the camels, and then with the camels themselves. And as for Nora, I was really, I grew up on Westerns. My family loved them. But as I've grown older and sort of like taken in more different kinds of Westerns, I've always been very curious about the pot stirring woman in the corner. I don't know if you know that trope, but it's always, there's always sort of like a scowling woman who's really bedraggled, like stirring a pot in the corner, and she has nothing to say, and she's doing one of two things: either scowling when the cowboys come in, or asking John not to go off on whatever adventure it is gonna kill him. So I was really curious to know her perspective, and I wanted to dwell inside her head on this really grueling day, during which she's just waiting for water, and during which she's just waiting.
So I have to go back to the camels because they're so great. The camels are very much a part of the story. They have their own characters themselves. As someone who has spent some time with camels, you really get a sense of their personality in here. So, a kind of a repeated theme in this is, everyone who is in this story is as shocked as we are to see camels in the West. They have no idea what they are. They're these sort of monstrous presences. And so I'm curious why you sort of chose to make them the sort of central point and what this sort of monstrous figure kind of does to all of these people that interact with them, who are already, spreading out west, have no idea what this creature is. So why camels to be sort of the hook of your story?
Sure. Well, I think that the image of a camel in the Southwest is really, really incongruous, and there's something really fascinating about this notion of this animal that is pedestrian in so many other parts of the world, being part of the Western landscape, which is so often affiliated with quadruped mounts. It's just horses and mules. But here's this other weird looking thing. I found it really fascinating to think about the camels as a source of, as you say, distress and sort of wonderment for the people that they passed, right? And the more I wrote, the more it became very clear to me that the camels represent basically a different thing to each group of people who encounters them. There are people who are making settlements out in the Southwest for whom their arrival represents progress, right? And the advancement of the nation, and in Arizona territory, certainly, interest from the rest of the country, which might indicate that they're now going to rise to statehood. It's progress, right? To the native people who encountered them, they certainly held some visual interest, but I think that they were just a sign of another culture's progress into their lands. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't really matter to them what the mechanism of that invasion was. The camels happened to be part of it. Mm-hmm. And to the men who brought them over, I think that they were sort of a source of identity. They were these animals that they had taken care of all their lives back in Izmir, where they came from, and I think that what ended up happening in the book is that their bonds with their camels, I think, reflect a kind of homesickness and an attempt to hold on to that old part of their lives that becomes distilled anytime you emigrate. So yeah.
Absolutely. And sort of just kind of to follow along those lines of identity and perception, I repeatedly, the camels are mistaken for horses or monsters, but there's lots of other kind of perception and identity swaps that happen. Lurie takes on a new persona, and it's not like in the West, the Camelier gang had, Camelier licenses. So you can just sort of get away with it. And there's other characters who sort of can recreate their own backstory or start over. So how do you sort of view this sort of kind of perpetual motion and ability to sort of rewrite history? How does that play into your character's sense of identity? And how do you create a sense of identity in this book with them sort of having this ability to kind of change things up if they want to?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one of the great lures of the West, or at least the way we mythologize the West, is the ability to reinvent, right? And that was sort of how it was posited at the time. It was go West and become whoever you want to be. And there's so much in the historical record about, particularly, for instance, lawmen. Like, lawmen would go out and they'd be outlaws half the year in one place and lawmen half the year in another, and then if you would just change your name. And it's only when historians after the fact begin to put two and two together that they realize, oh, you were the same person. And this ability to shed your former life, at least outwardly, was really, really appealing, I think. However, I think that something that fascinated me a lot was because this is a novel that dwells in the psychology of its characters a great deal. Lurie is in the first person, Nora is close third, and so their perspectives are central to the way the story is told. I wanted to explore the gap between the fact that you can shed your identity on the outside but not on the inside, and that all your identities and all your ghosts, really, you carry with you into each iteration of yourself. And that's something that, only each individual knows about. And in the case of Lurie, he is sort of confessing it all to Burke. And in Nora's case, she's in conversation all the time with the imagined ghost of her dead daughter, who died as a baby, but who's sort of grown up in Nora's mind and is now 17. And they have these conversations, which Nora is fully aware are imaginary, but are really, really necessary to her, to the invention of who she has become and who she's trying to make her daughter become.
Yeah, and both characters really have this interesting connection to the supernatural, with Nora constantly in conversation with Evelyn, knowing that it's not really Evelyn. Meanwhile, she's got a niece who is totally gaga for seances, and she totally kind of dismisses that as nonsense while she's talking to her dead grown-up daughter. And then Lurie, on the other hand, he also has this sort of strange relationship with ghosts who, they inhabit him with these wants. So, I mean, these two characters have two very different, or really a bunch of the characters have different relationships to the supernatural. So did you sort of go into it knowing that you were going to put this element in there, or do you think that that's sort of just a part of what it was like to be in the West in that time, and you kind of went to that place, or how did that get incorporated?
It always somehow gets incorporated into my work, which I guess is telling in a way, but of what, I don't know. So Lurie started out immediately being able to see the dead. It just sort of appeared on paper in the very, very first draft when I wrote him, and that was very, it came as a surprise to me, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess that makes sense somehow, or it will eventually. And then Nora's relationship to Evelyn did too. I think that there's something particularly haunted about landscapes that see a lot of turmoil. You can't help but feel that whatever turbulence is affecting the living must also be affecting the dead. And that, to me, was an overwhelming psychological and emotional fact as I went into this book, I think, and it just it had to happen. Yeah.
Wow. Well, so another thing that I sort of noticed as a theme throughout is just sort of this constant movement. Even though Nora, it's just the course of one day, there's a sort of constant feeling of movement, of thirst. I think the word that came up for me a bunch of times was restlessness. And then, of course, Lurie is actually moving, across the country as well. So what was it like to create a moving setting for this?
It was really enjoyable. I think movement is something that we associate with the West. This notion of this picaresque journey of these small communities, these strange spaces, these incredible landscapes, and there was something, because the structure of the novel was predetermined by the history that defined it. The only way that I could develop it was with these with moments of interiority, with psychological exploration, and then also with trying to figure out how the movement of one character was going to bring him in contact with the other. And so it was really something to luxuriate in a way. I think that as writers, we sort of hold on to our indulgences as much as we can. And for me, it was trying to see how far this camel could go and what kind of landscapes he could shock people in, and what use there might be for him in this world.
So just to look backwards a little bit, your award-winning debut, Tiger's Wife, was set in a fictional country in the Balkans, and it drew on your own sort of personal history and knowledge of that area. So what was it like writing this sort of different setting that is not one that, you know, has the same connection for you or has a different connection for you? And how did that sort of affect the final product?
Sure. I think that something that definitely was different here was that I had to do a tremendous amount of research, because in the parts that are sort of more realist, we spend one day with Nora. The minutiae of her day are really, really important to her life. I had to research newspapers and how they worked in the 1800s, and how water was sourced, what happened to a town when a county seat moves from one place to another. All these sort of small details that I didn't know. So that was enjoyable. But I think that I started writing this book thinking that it was quite distant from me. But the truth is that you're always drawn, I think as a writer, you're always drawn to a particular project for deeply personal reasons that you don't know at the start, but then you sort of work out as you write. And what drew me, it turns out, was this story of these men who had come from the Ottoman Empire, which at the time where I come from would have been under 2, and who were trying to find their place in this new land, building what it was supposed to become, but sort of displaced. And I think that the idea of displacement and how you hold on to identity and how you form identity, and I don't mean identity in the sense of what identity you're ascribed, but how you feel and where you feel you belong or don't, and whether you can or not ever properly belong if you've lived for so much of your life somewhere else. It really struck me at the end, and I wanted to explore that, and this was a way to do it, I think.
Well, that's pretty amazing. I think at this point we're gonna take some of your questions. So why don't we start with this one up here? Oh. I think I clicked something I wasn't supposed to. Why don't we start with this one that says, can you give us insight into how you go about creating realistic mythologies? How heavily do you lean on mythologies that already exist?
Ooh, that's great. I lean very heavily on mythologies that already exist. And in particular, I think that the entire genre of the Western is built up on this particular mythos of like the journey, most specifically a man on a journey, this idea of reinvention, the idea of stories that outlive people, right? And that's sort of how I think of myth in general, not in the religious sense perhaps, but more in the folklore sense, stories that outlive people. And I think that the central question always for me when building a mythology in the book is, who would find this remarkable and how long would it last? Like what would be the endurance of this kind of story, and how would it change in every telling, and how would it grow, and what would become false about it, and how would people respond to that falsehood? Because that's how we tell stories, right? Like I'm going to tell you a story. When you turn around and tell it to Sam, it's not that you're going to embellish, but you're going to forget little facts of mine. You're not going to quite be able to put it together exactly, especially some time has gone by. You'll add a little bit, then Sam will add a little bit more. If it's a particularly great story, people will keep adding and changing it. And I'm really interested in how that happens.
And did you find any kind of, you obviously uncovered this very cool tidbit about the camels that everyone else. Was there anything else that sort of struck you as maybe underrepresented in this sort of our current idea of what Western mythologies look like?
Well, I mean, so much. Obviously, I think one of the things that was really not incredible, unsurprising, but illuminating to discover was the amount of diversity that actually existed in immigrating populations, and the communities that formed that populated the West and sort of formed these towns. People were from all over the place, and they brought. You'll find these. I went to Deadwood, for instance, because I loved the show and I was fascinated with the area, and I went to Deadwood, and they had a whole display on Slavs in the West, and I had no idea. I had no idea. So I think that one of mythology's, or not mythology, the power of mythos is that it's big and sweeping, and we feel engaged by it and as if we are a part of it. That power, because it's so big, erases all these small details, and simplifies and simplifies and simplifies itself. And it's, in researching history is when we can really discover what the granular detail of it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I loved that part. I mean, it's a different picture than what you might expect. All right, why don't we go for this one? You mentioned you were researching the West because you were spending a lot of time there. What brought you there?
Great question. My husband and I went on holiday to Wyoming, and I arrived there and was just blown away. And I turned to him immediately and was like, I'm never leaving. So I don't know, you can go and, continue to live your life, but I'm here now. So we've come to split time, but, I think that what staggered me about it was I felt so, after the first few times I was out there and in Arizona too, I felt deeply, deeply, deeply homesick for it, which was odd because I've moved around all my life. I grew up in Cyprus and Egypt after we left the former Yugoslavia. We were in Georgia. We were in California. So home for me has never been about place. It's always been about people. But to be homesick for an area, for a region, or for a landscape in which you have no cultural or familial roots, is odd, and to feel you belong there is odd, but it must somehow be tied to why the West has such a powerful narrative draw. Because I can't be the first person who felt that way. And I wanted to, even before I knew that the subject matter of Inland, I knew I wanted to dig around in that feeling, and see where it came from.
Wow, yeah, and I think that's something that maybe Lurie would echo. He's constantly moving, but his home is really, with Burke.
Burke is his camel.
It's a great camel. Burke after the noise they make, which then it makes sense, right? Okay, let's go to this last question. How did the process of writing this book compare to that of writing The Tiger's Wife? Was one more fun or adventurous than the other, more challenging?
I think this one was more adventurous because the other one, when I wrote The Tiger's Wife, I knew what was baked into it was the emotional resonance of the book. My grandfather, whom I adored and who raised me, had died, and to me, he had felt like this immortal figure my whole life. And I think I was, despite the fact that there were signs he would pass, I think I was pretty sure that he would beat his cancer and, make it out alive. And when he didn't, it was a huge shock. And I think I had a huge crisis of faith as a result. And when I started writing the book, it's not an autobiographical book, but the emotional relationships between the characters are baked in. That is based on a truth that is as old as my lifetime. That was true in its heart. And then everything else was made up, the country and the conflicts and the characters and all this sort of bonkers folklore around it. So as I wrote that book, I didn't know what was going to happen in it. And I didn't know what the journey was. In this book, I knew what the journey was because it was set. There's a factual history, and you have to write to that. And I knew from the beginning that I would have to write to that. And by the way, I know you've read the book all the way through, so you'll know what this means. Everything, that ending is also part of the original story.
Oh.
So yeah. So I was writing towards something that had a template, and so the adventuring happened in the psychologies of the characters and how the puzzle was going to come together. And I think in many ways, from a craft perspective, it was a much bigger challenge than the emotional challenge of the previous one, if that makes sense.
Wow, yeah, definitely. So I guess that's our audience questions, unless anyone wants to contribute. But I'll just sort of got one over here.
Curious if you could talk about your relationship with Colum McCann.
Sure. Sure. Colum is a dear friend and colleague. We did my launch together last night. He was a mentor of mine with the first book, and since then we've ended up working at Hunter College together. So we collaborate we read a lot of young student work together. We have very different takes on how to approach writing from start to finish, even though I think that what we appreciate in writing is very similar. So it makes for a lot of very lively debate on what directions students need to take their writing in and how to guide our students toward the best path for them. But yeah, he's wonderful. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I'll just wrap up sort of with one last question. This is day 2 of Inland being on sale. It's gotten some really great reviews. Some cool people like Barack Obama are reading it. Pretty special. So not to rush you or anything, and I know people hate answering what you're working on next. So instead I'll ask you, what are you drawing inspiration from next? What's inspiring you right now?
Robinson Crusoe.
Intriguing.
It's true. Yeah.
More adventures to come. So thank you so much, Téa, and thank you all for coming. There's books for sale right outside the door, and Téa would be happy to sign them for you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Leila.
Thanks.